Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 92 of PHP Roundtable. And I am especially excited about this one. We have a topic that is kind of a mystery to a lot of people, kind of a bane of existence to others. And then you have a few, like our panelists, who really embrace it. It's event sourcing. I'm by no means an expert on event sourcing. I don't even pretend to be, but I've done it. It was one of these uh, patterns, workflows, philosophies, I don't know, that I struggle to get my head around and struggle to see the benefit to. But once I started doing it, I really kind of enjoyed it. But my particular implementation was not a pleasant one. I was learning a lot of new concepts and had to think about data differently and how I handle data. But again, something I enjoyed, and ever since the few projects I've worked on with event sourcing, I've looked for ways to streamline those implementations. We have a couple people on our panel today who are also working towards that, and it's exciting stuff. Now, if you don't know what event sourcing is, I beg that you hang out with us for a little while, because this is going to be mind-blowing knowledge that you're not going to get anywhere else. That's a lie. You can probably find it a lot of places, but I'm just saying that for now. For me, as a layman, to understand event sourcing the way my brain worked is I thought about my bank account, right? If you think about your bank account, and if you looked at your balance in your bank account and you saw that there was $150 in your account, but it didn't explain to you how you got to that $150, it would be frustrating. You would just have to assume that data is correct. You have no idea how that data got to that state and what accountability what there was for that. But that's not how bank accounts work. You log in, you see your balance, and then you see all the transactions that got you to that balance. The thing about that is that data is always moving forward. You don't just correct data. There are entries in your account that shows the correction of data. So if your bank makes a mistake and accidentally withdraws too much money, they'll deposit that money back, and you'll see those transactions in your bank statement. That philosophy, that understanding, is what really helped me get my head around event sourcing. The concept that data is always moving forward. You can never remove data. If you're an accountant, you understand these theories. Like, once something goes in the ledger, it's in the ledger. You can't erase it. You have to correct it with other ledger entries moving forward. So kind of the same concept. The point being, with event sourcing, you understand how the data that's in your database got in that state. Now, there are other ways of doing it. There's other auditing packages you have out there, and what differentiates them from event sourcing, we'll get into that a little bit today. But for now, let me go ahead and bring in my fellow panelist for today, TJ Miller. Hey, TJ.
Yo, what's up, man?
What's going on? I mean,
Oh, not too much, dude. I'm so excited for today.
this is so exciting. Now, have you ever done any event sourcing yourself?
I haven't. I actually really struggled to understand the concept until verbs came out, and I don't know why, but the kind of translation layer that they did on top of event sourcing just started to make so much more sense for me. So I've been looking for some use cases. I'd love to get working on it at some point.
All right. So you want to bring your guests in? You ready for this?
Yeah, let's do it, man.
All right, so let's go. We have three guest panelists today, and I am going to start. I guess I'll start in reverse order of my list, because I don't want to make anything simple here. I should have warned them before we started the show, TJ, that I am horrible with names. There's one name on here I absolutely love, but in general, I'm horrible with names. So I will say their name, and they can correct me when they come on. Just to give you a warning. So first off, we have Daniel Coilbourne. He's a Laravel developer and founder of Thunk, a four-person product dev shop. He loves event sourcing, Livewire, my kind of guy, and talking through programming problems. He has a few podcasts. No Plans to Merge with Caleb Porzio, again, Livewire, gotta love it. Talking Business with John Drexler, where they discuss the day-to-day of running a small agency. He's also speaking about Verbs, the event sourcing package for Laravel at Laracon US at the end of the month. Let's welcome Daniel.
Hey, what's up?
Hey man, how's it going?
Going great. Happy to be here.
Good. I thought, did I miss a podcast? I thought you had 3 podcasts. No?
I have had several other podcasts in my short time on Earth, but I've got 2 active podcasts.
Yeah. So it was No Plans to Merge with Caleb. Obviously, I was right in at the beginning of Livewire, where he started talking about the idea behind Livewire, started coding it, got excited about it. I jumped on that bandwagon very, very, very early and have just been a fan of it ever since. I love Livewire and the work he's done with it. So I thought it was next time you speak to him, you let him know thanks from me.
Cool. I'll talk to him later today. So I'll let
Did I pronounce your last name right?
You
Coilbourne?
did actually, yeah.
Oh man, that was all right. Okay, next is Daniel's partner, co-maintainer of the Verbs package, Chris Morrell, who is a CEO and avid open source contributor. He's been writing PHP since the release of PHP 3 in the 90s and host of the Over Engineer podcast. Hey, Chris.
Hey, excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. All right, finally, the guy with the coolest name on the internet. I even asked him, I'm like, is that really your last name? And he's like, yeah, dickhead. You don't think it's not my last name? Shawn McCool. Now, if you don't know who Shawn McCool is, he was an early Laravel evangelist and created Laravel.io. He actually also started the Laravel podcast and is a co-founder of Laravel EU. He's created over a 3-hour-long event sourcing series called Event Sorcery, and it's now available on YouTube for free. So after this podcast, you might want to go over there and check this out. Great stuff. He's built and maintained an event source transaction processing system. And when I asked him to come on the show, he's like, yeah, you're going to need me to come on the show because this verb shit, I don't know what this is about. This is horrible. I might be paraphrasing. Shawn McCool, how's it going, sir?
It's going great. None of that happened.
Yeah.
So Shawn, you're over in Amsterdam, correct?
Just south, yeah.
Just so thanks. I know it's very late for you. And Chris and Daniel, you guys are on the East Coast somewhere?
Yep, I'm in Philly.
And I'm
Philly.
in Asheville, North Carolina.
Ah, cool. So, yeah, appreciate everybody being here. Event sourcing. All right, let's get the topic rolling here. How do you rate my explanation of event sourcing to a kindergartner? Like, is it like almost there, or how would you explain event sourcing and the benefits of it?
I think you did a good job. I think all of us were kind of chuckling over here about the banking example because as event sourcing believers, I think we are all a little sick of the banking example, but it really is a perfect analogy for people to kind of grasp the concept. So I think that's a great place to start. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny when we were selling the concept of event sourcing to a client, it just so happened we had the CFO on the call at the same time and trying to explain event sourcing and why we want it. And I kept focusing on the kind of the accountability of the data. And I'm like, okay, but we need to understand how the data got in that state. Like, why is that data in the database and how to get there? And the CFO piped in and goes, I totally understand what you're saying. We have the same concept in accounting, and I forget what it's called, double booking or double book entry or something like that. And he explained that, and I'm like, yeah, that's way better than what I was saying. Thank you. And so ever since then, I've kind of clung on to that explanation of event sourcing.
I
So-
think. Oh, go ahead.
So I was going to say, now let's be real here. Like, event sourcing isn't just something you stumble on, right? There's usually like you feel like there's a reason you need it. Is that fair to say? Like, or did you guys just think, oh yeah, I want to try something different. Let's see what this event sourcing is about.
Yeah,
Take your
I
time.
mean, I think I think you're right. It's not something that you're just going to reach for the moment that you write your first hello world. In our case, we are a trade organization for home inspectors, and we deal with a lot of licensing considerations. So having really good record keeping around the exam side of things, people taking exams through us for their home inspector license, being able to demonstrate exactly what happened, when it happened, how it happened, why it happened. Those types of things were really important for us, and that was the first place that I ever really thought to reach for event sourcing. I'd been kind of curious about it until then. So I will admit that it was kind of like this little thing kind of floating over here, me waiting for a good opportunity to jump on it. But that was the first moment when it really made sense to explore it seriously.
Yeah, I agree. I was like cognitively like aware of event sourcing and had heard the banking example, as as we all have, and was like, well, I'm not a finance startup, so I don't need this because I have no balanced ledger to maintain, and so this is this is not for me. But it was really interesting, and like the concept of like deriving the state of the world from a record of what happened was interesting to me, right? And I was working for Chris at the time, and so when we started journeying down this path to the exam system, I actually watched Event Sorcery, Shawn's video series, and had like a mildly psychedelic experience, like just thinking. I don't know. I think the thing that the banking example fails to capture is that like there is a dimension to data that we're just throwing out, right? And that like
100%.
there's an entire axis upon which we could be tracking data that we're not, right? And so, or at least in like traditional like active record apps, right? Like we're just storing data in like a very flat two-dimensional way. And if you ever want to ask any question about that data, besides the exact question that it wants to answer, it's very, very hard to get a good answer from that, right? And as soon as I like saw the depth of data as like the real promise of event sourcing, right? That it's not like, I think the things that you described, Eric, are like very they're easy sort of first on ramps, right? Where it's like, oh, like a log, or like we could track the history of something. That makes sense, and like that is true. You can do those things, but like to me, like the real value here is like that. Like schema is kind of ephemeral concept, right? Like schema is what it is. Like we have like a fire hose of real data over here, and like it can be whatever we need it to be, right? And like however we need it, whatever shape we need it in. Like this data is like, if we know what happened, we can figure out anything else from there. So I don't know.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Traditionally, you like you make mutations and you have the state changes in your system, and that's the important part. But this kind of turns it on its head, and it says the mutations are the important part, and the state changes, those things that you normally read from, can be, you have a lot of flexibility on how you can treat those things. I got into event sourcing because at some point in time I realized that events are actually a really good decoupling pattern. So we started using domain events a lot when to simplify the code base. And so going from that and being really fascinated with domain events, and eventually kind of coming across this idea that you can kind of change the way you think about these systems and focus on these domain events. Because when I'm thinking of like a traditional data-driven system, I'm thinking, okay, I need to understand the process that I'm implementing, that I map that into a set of state mutations in a relational database generally. And with this, I'm much more often working with these ideas that are the same ideas that we're having the discussions about in our meetings, and these same processes. Suddenly these ideas, they manifest more in the code, and it's like more of a direct mapping. I don't have to be constantly doing this mega brain thing of having to map these business processes to these relational state changes.
I definitely think that that's a big one. Like when you start to realize, all those conversations that you have with non-technical folks tend to be, well, when I do this, right? They always start with an action, right?
Mhm.
And we as programmers end up, doing all the mental gymnastics of taking the when I do this need that the end user has, and trying to convert that into a has many relationship or whatever, right? And but it's not that, right? We're trying to manufacture an approximation of what the actual process is, whereas with event sourcing, you just do the thing that you do, whatever the thing is.
Yeah,
And you don't have to do those gymnastics.
I think that's a great point, and to Daniel's point as well. I think one of the things that made my initial step into event sourcing, the first thing I was able to embrace, it wasn't that challenging, which is the idea of losing the schema, right? You're not worried about schema of data anymore. I had been using document stores for a while, specifically CouchDB. So I had already started to train my brain of this idea of there's no schema to data. You capture the data, and then we can figure out what data we need out of that. And this kind of brings me to an interesting talking point. So we're all Laravel people here.
I think Shawn is transcended.
Yeah, I was trying not to send him too much hate, but yes, he's left us in the dust. But and not only Laravel, just PHP as a whole. He's like, no, I'm shutting the door on that part of my life. As Laravel people here, so the event sourcing implementations I've done within Laravel applications, but it could have just been PHP applications. I've kind of extracted away and did all that, always secretly hoping and wishing there was just this one easy package I could install and use for event sourcing. And that's kind of, Chris and Daniel, what you've been working on with verbs. Matter of fact, I think I have it up here. Let me see. Let me switch over. Nope, I got to share again. Let me share again. Don't judge me. I'm getting there. So you guys have this package out called verbs. And if you're just getting into event sourcing, I don't know. I'm torn on this, to be honest with you. I love what you guys are doing. But so we're talking about schemaless implementations, and there's this concept in event sourcing called a projection. Now, I notice if I'm oversimplifying this, let me know. But in your package, basically the projection is you kind of use the models as projections, or do you just abandon the idea of models altogether? And this is a two-part question. And my first part, I guess, let's start with my first part too. Event sourcing has very specific naming conventions of different parts, aggregates, projections, things like that. It seems like you two made a decision in your package to kind of deviate a little bit from those traditional naming conventions. Is there a reason or a thought behind that? I was just curious about that one point first.
Yeah, I was gonna say before we dive into that, like, can we talk about what the different parts about like of that make up event sourcing. And then I think that the perfect segue into kind of that translation layer between like what Verbs is calling things and what I think you'd see more traditionally, because like that translation layer is like actually what helped make sense for me out of event sourcing.
Whoa. Yeah,
that was
totally.
a long talking about translation layers. That was a transition layer.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to cover the basics in sort of traditional terminology. And I do think, I mean, I think that we wanted to walk away from some of the traditional event sourcing terminology because when you start off the bat with things like aggregate roots and projections, and it can be very off-putting when the underlying concepts aren't so off-putting. And so the choice, to think of things as states and events, and kind of like abstract away the concept of projections and reactions and stuff like that to just terms that are a little bit more familiar, event handlers, event listeners, things like that. These words just kind of, I think, make a little bit more sense to folks. But I do think that once you get into talking about event sourcing, I mean, I know like on my team, we still use the word projection, right? When we're talking about taking the state and projecting it to some other place. Often that'll be models. It doesn't have to be. But I think it's worth talking about the terms for sure.
Yeah, especially projections, right? Because when you're especially coming from a traditional web application, you're used to you intentionally try not to duplicate data, right? That's one of your goals. Like if you have data in one table and it needs to be part of data in another table, you create a relationship. That's kind of one of the basic concepts. But with projections, that's not the case. And this was one of the cool things, one of the first things I embraced when I was doing event sourcing. Is like, okay, cool. Since I don't have a schema with my data is just, in my case, was just a serialized chunk of text. When I need certain parts of that data for a piece of my application, I can now project it to its own table and only have the data I need for that piece of the application. I don't know if that's how projections were meant to be used, but it's how I implemented it. And it's one of these concepts that's really kind of weird to get your head around, because you always want to say, well, okay, I need to project to this table, and I need to project to this table, and I need to create a relationship between these two tables. And you don't need to do that, right? Or at least the way my approach, I didn't need to do that.
Can I clarify a point real quick?
Yes.
I feel like we talk about schema and we're talking about it in a specific way. So when you're saying schema, I'm hearing the database tables that would normally back your active record models. But when I think schema, I think the structure of your events, right? So your events have schema. And actually, this is probably one of the most challenging parts of event sourcing. Is schema versioning over time, model versioning. So just to clarify, if you're not familiar, yes, you can reproject your event state into whatever schema you want, whether it's a document store or graph database or just tables that will back active record models. But the event schemas require a lot of attention and maintenance over time, and this is one of the probably biggest downsides, I would say, to event sourcing.
For sure. Yeah, that's really tricky, because once, that one of the core principles is, once you have written an event to your event store, it is memorialized forever, right? That is the truth, and you can't change it. And so, if in 6 years you wish you had done it differently, like, too bad. And that
Not too
event
bad.
is
Not too bad. There's so many wonderful ways. The beauty of this thing. Okay, the beauty of this thing. I'm sorry to get
No.
but everything is just one atomic unit. So since
Yes.
everything in your system is an event, all of your tooling built to manage events, suddenly magnifies in power. Everything that you have, all your pipelines that events run through, everything is so much more valuable because you have this primary atomic unit, and it's generalized now because it's a particle that you can pass around. So you have like infinite options. You can just say, oh, I'm going to say for these transactions that occurred between January 1st of 2018 and February 8th of 2019, I'm going to read those and I'm going to reproject those into a new streams. And then I'm going to leave a tombstone event at the end of the old stream saying, hey, go look at this new stream. And then you have all these mechanisms. It's like the way that we value waste and avoid waste and stuff like this in a relational approach to software development, they don't apply the same. So there's a lot of techniques and ways of thinking that really have to change to get maximum efficiency, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And to sort of jump back to kind of like the language question, right? Like we have like very specific goals with verbs, right? And like I think our goal with verbs was to make an event sourcing package that could be very approachable by the average Laravel developer, right? And like we want our friends and colleagues who are Laravel developers to be able to get their head into event sourcing, right? And to not have to sort of sit them down and explain everything from first principles. Although I do tell everyone to go watch Event Sorcery and start with what is a model, right? Which is where Shawn starts in Event Sorcery. But like our goal is like a lot of these concepts are scary, and if we can do a good enough job putting in a few guardrails to stop you from hurting yourself as much as possible, then there's a lot of places where we can get you to sort of an 80-20, like get a lot of value by having events without necessarily throwing you all the way into like, you can't have any non-event sourced eloquent models or, like any of that. So I think, just to be practical, like, I mean, I onboard into people's projects all the time, right? And as I'm onboarding into their projects, a lot of the times they called me because they saw a conference talk about event sourcing and they were interested, right? And it's just a non-starter for these existing 15-year-old apps to say, like, we're now going to start event sourcing things, like everything in your app, right? Like there has to be an incremental approach to that, right? For legacy applications. And so our goal always has been almost a rhetorical goal of like, how can we position event sourcing to be accessible and to bat away as many of the objections as possible that we had ourselves at first and that we're getting from clients and friends and colleagues as we sort of bring this up to them of why they could never do event sourcing, right? And so a lot of this is a rhetorical project, right?
It's very much a subset of everything that event sourcing can do. I mean, we're really just scratching the surface and giving you, a really solid foundation to build a reasonable application using these techniques. Yeah, for sure.
And like Shawn was saying, right? Like, if you've been using verbs for a year or two and you like realize that you want to like roll your own event sourcing system to deal with a particular need you have, well, at least thank God you've got a stream of events to do it with, right? Like migrating from events to better events is drastically easier than migrating from no events to events, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess I take responsibility for splintering that conversation a little bit, but I do want to. I guess I think TJ had a good idea about the kind of what things are called. So we've kind of talked about projections and what they are. There's also aggregate roots. How would you explain an aggregate root to somebody?
I would first try not to. So the thing about event
Perfect answer.
sourcing that needs to have focus is the events are the thing that matters, right? Your aggregates, your aggregate roots, these are ephemeral things that can be rewritten, trashed, thrown away, completely changed. This is just code. This is not the same as like having an active record model called user, and then that thing fills up with a bunch of data. You don't have to go migrate something later. The aggregate is a very special thing in event sourced model. So the word aggregate comes out of the domain driven design kind of set of common patterns. And the whole reason for that is to say, hey, we need to be able to manage consistency over multiple entities, etc. Let's all bound it into a single boundary, tell it we want to mutate, make a state change, and then make that state change in a single transaction. So aggregate really means immediately consistent transactional boundary, right? So that's kind of like the point of it. But when you're dealing with events, why would you need that? Let's say something happens, you throw an event in the database. Now you know that thing happened. Well, every once in a while, you may need to say, well, based on the state in a previous event, I want to make a rule that I'm going to fire event B instead of event A, or I'm just going to not allow an event to be fired at all. And it's based on a previous state. So what we're doing is we say, okay, stop the world. We're going to take all of our complex asynchronous system and we're going to limit it down to a single point. And then we load, you would like have some kind of lock here. You can use optimistic locking, mutex locking, whatever. We load the events in a stream into an in-memory store so that we can query that in-memory store. Then we make a decision, and then new events may or may not come out, right? So the whole point of an aggregate is just to have this in-memory store for immediate consistency. Because if you use a projection, if you say, I'm listening to events and I'm creating state, that projection is only as up to date as your message bus, the dispatch time it takes, however long. But the point of the aggregate is we are creating a lock so that no state changes are happening outside of this for this scope, which is usually like an entity identifier. We project the state, try to make a state change, and if we do make a state change, that state change is a new event or one or more, and we save all that, and then we close down the lock. So it's a really, really difficult thing to talk about, especially because there's an instinct to map an active record model to an aggregate, or like a data model to an aggregate, and it's really not that. It's really just about it being an in-memory projection for immediate consistency.
Yeah, I like to just think of aggregates as a place. I mean, this is a much less technical interpretation, but just a place to hold data about past events, to aggregate data about past events, just like you would call an aggregate function in MySQL to get the sum of all your tables. You're just aggregating sum of past events into a current state so that you can make decisions about future events. If we go back to the banking example, I need to have some understanding of the current state of a balance to make decisions about whether a withdrawal is allowed, right? That's a good example of where you would use an aggregate for. And in verbs, we call that state. I feel justified listening to Shawn use the word state a bunch of times in his explanation, just because that's a little bit more familiar, but they're essentially the same thing.
Yeah. I think state, this is just, I'm always interested in the rhetorical angle here and like what is most convincing to people, right? And like that's the thing that I'm like most, because like I'm sold, right? But like
Right.
I have to sell everyone else if I want to be able to work on these projects all the time, right? And so like to me, I think that the thing that the state forward argument I think is really, it works well because the magic of like being like, people need to know the state of the world at times, right? And like sometimes that needs to be projected into a database table. Sometimes it needs to be, written into a PDF. Who cares, right? But there's, moments snap together like magnets. Like there's these moments where we need to know what is real, right? And being able to take a long history of events and condense them down to sometimes a single integer or a single Boolean is like really, really powerful. And I think that's the real magic, right? Like people like to think of like, oh, I have a long history of all of my events. But the real magic is like, yeah, but you can smush infinite reams of data down into a Boolean and it can be right, and that to me, that's like really cool.
Yeah, I'm surprised you don't like the term immediately consistent transactional boundary.
Yeah, it's as convincing as it often is to the newcomer.
All right, so let's you brought it up, Daniel, where you said you're sold on the concept, and when you have a double clawed hammer, everything looks like a nail. What is the right time to do event sourcing?
So I'm just gonna like be an extremist on this podcast, and you guys can
Do
moderate me. Is that cool? Everything I say, I'm just gonna take like the hard rhetorical position of like everyone should be like me. But my argument is that the most fun and best time to event source is as you are figuring out what your app does, right? Like as you are like understanding the behavior of your application. So I've been writing a lot of greenfield event source apps with verbs recently. And I have never been as productive writing MVPs as I am with Livewire and verbs right now, right? Like just, I've given myself enough tooling to be able to move very fast. And I'm literally just like, because when you think, and Shawn sort of got to this, like when you ask people in a business what the app needs to do, like their answer is always something happened, or I did something, or someone did something, or the thing. They speak in verbs, and this is like the reason verbs is called verbs is that like, as object-oriented programmers, like we have this this original sin of trying to fit everything we know into nouns, right? And like we can only know things if they're nouns, right? But when I start to think in verbs and store verbs and work in verbs, as far as something happened, I'm doing something, actions and events, right? When I start to think that way, the barriers, the translation barrier of like, oh, well, what does that mean about the status column? Like, or like what timestamps got set when that happened? Who gives a shit? Like I want to know what happened and how, right? And so when I start working that way, I'm able to just vomit out features at an insane pace. And, and eventually I have to make like performance improvements where I'm like, oh, I probably should have like a table in a database so that I can query some, but not all of these things that happen. But at first, before performance is a concern, before any of that's a concern, when I'm just like cranking out functionality, like just events are the way,
It sounds, Daniel, like you might be a good candidate for studying domain-driven design.
Yeah, that's funny because a big part of my rhetorical position here has been that saddling event sourcing with DDD or like tying them too closely together is a big part of the reason that event sourcing hasn't spread more than it has, right? And so like while I'm actually like I don't really have much of a problem with DDD. I do sort of have a problem with us not being able to talk about event sourcing without talking about it,
Yeah, I think that there might be a misunderstanding though, because events are not verbs. They're statements with subjects and predicates, right? What verbs are behaviors. And you're talking about the difference between writing software, focusing and modeling behavior over modeling state changes with the typical way you would have a data bag, like an active record object, and then transaction scripts, which is the traditional way that frameworks and approach software development. So DDD is really heavily focused on modeling behavior and building behavior into systems. And that's why it's so tied to things like event sourcing, where this paradigm matches up. So I don't think there's anything specifically verby about event sourcing, actually. If you think about what does an event say? Member registered. Well, yes, the member registered, but the member's a noun, right? And the only difference really is now we're so much more focused on behavior over data, because data-based events are almost useless in comparison to behavior-based events.
Can you sorry, data-based events are almost useless in comparison to behavior-based. Can you break that down for me?
Yeah, so if we have a user entity and we say user updated, user created, user deleted, right? If we have events that are generically about data changes, data mutations, then they're not particularly useful, right? They're much less interesting because what do you listen to? Like if I have an event-driven system now and I say that this transaction authentication was declined, now any system that reacts to that knows what to react to. But if I have a data-oriented event, I listen to transaction was updated, and then I check the state of it, and I do a check and analysis, and I implicitly try to understand it. But because it's focused on the behavior, it's explicitly about something meaningfully worth reacting to.
Yeah, and I mean, and worth noting too is like, not only like do you lose all of the sort of like behavioral, descriptiveness of your events, and like I would argue like narrative usefulness of your events when you do that, it's also just like much slower to implement that than just like directly editing the data.
It's so
like,
hard.
You may as well just get in there and edit the data.
It's crazy. Like I did not expect this one. I expected I'm going to go into event sourcing. It's going to be hard, and I'm going to get some benefit from it in some small number of circumstances. But what I discovered is when I make something, it's easy, and when I think about doing it the other way, I am like, I'm going to have to be way smarter than I am in order to hold all that in my head.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that I like wish, like, I always feel like I'm having a nonsense nightmare argument with people when they're asking me like, oh, well, like, is it worth it for me to do this hard thing? And like, that to me, I always feel like I'm like fighting uphill to convince people that it's not that bad, when really the thing I want to tell them is that like, you have no idea. Like, like you haven't yet had the spiritual awakening that awaits you on the other side of like scaffolding a feature using events. Like it's just like, I don't know. It's amazing.
It's true though. Once you start to think in this sort of, once you start to adapt to this mindset, I find that I'm working on non-event source features, and I constantly have that, God, if there were events here, this would be so much easier for me to reason about. The discreteness of each individual event, and the keeping everything scoped down to just what happened. And another piece of it is just like, you can get to the same destination a lot of different ways, and losing the way we got here, it's just like tragic. Once you have it, then you start missing, well, okay, this value is what it is now, but why, how, and you start introducing, audit logging and other sort of, you start reverse engineering the why, when if you just had events, you just would have it from the get-go.
And when you have the events, you have the ability to ask what if, which is like something that like you totally don't have in like a flat two-dimensional active record situation.
Can I ask you a question? Working with different clients, et cetera, do you find that when you're working on an event sourced model, the work is easier to predict and plan as far as how much investment is going to go into a certain scope?
I think it's easier to write down, right? So I think that part at the very least is simpler, right? Like it's so much simpler to describe, like getting from like business requirement to programming requirement. It's just like a much cleaner transition. So like from like a project management perspective, just like writing tickets, like the tickets almost one-to-one map onto events, right? like that, they almost one-to-one. Sometimes you use 2 or 3 events to complete a ticket, right? But like very often it's just like, yeah, like this thing happened, and then like the effects of that. You're like, oh great, go do it.
The similar shape of the solution to the understanding of what we want to change is such a huge feature, because I think that one problem we end up with if we're using like data models and transaction scripts on those is that a seemingly small and simple change might require a significant amount of work. But when we are focused on having the software that is shaped with the conceptual model of whatever solution space we're working within, when someone says we need to modify this, it's very easy to say, oh, well, that's a small change equals a small cost to change. But a big change, of course, is going to require probably a large cost.
Yeah, totally. And I do find that like the places where I have like the most like lost time and energy in my work with clients where we're implementing event sourcing is at the boundaries, right? It's at the boundaries where some non-evented part of the app where we had to write some very like specific code to get these things to interface, right? Like something there changes, and then now we have to update sort of the non-evented side of the world, you know, and that's always complicated. And I feel like honestly, like if I'm becoming an expert at anything right now, it's like letting event sourcing exist within a legacy app, right? And like that's a really, really hard problem. Like,
yeah,
it's a really hard problem.
I've gone down that path. If I can for a second, we've covered some terminology, but there's still another term out there, and we got a question about it on YouTube. God Object asked, what would you version events in? What is snapshotting? It feels like this will become prevalent at some point.
Chris, you want to talk about snapshots?
Sure. I mean, snapshotting in verbs, maybe there are other, I'm not exactly sure if this is what you're asking, but snapshotting is just a way to basically store the aggregate state so we don't have to recompute it at the moment. So it's just an optimization. Event versioning is something that we haven't solved yet in verbs, and it's something that is coming up. But you have to accept that events, the shape of your events are going to change over time, and you need to have some understanding of how to account for those changes. And there are different ways to approach versioning. I think that we're going to be looking at some sort of simple migration approach, but I hope that answers the question a little bit.
I think so. I mean, Shawn, what is a snapshot?
Yeah. So as Chris mentioned, so if you have this bank account, right? And so my problem with the bank account example is not that it's overused or something. I think it's actually really illustrative, but my problem is it's not a practical use case for event sourcing. It's just not so like, why would you use any software architecture? It's not because you couldn't have written it another way. You can always have written it another way. It's the problem is that you make the decisions that are going to make the work easier, right? So you're making efficiencies over time. So you choose to event source because you believe that over the next 3 years, this is going to pay off, right? But if you're going to have any long running event stream, that's going to be a problem. And I don't mean long running like a month or 2 months. I mean long running like a lot of events. It's not about the time, it's about the amount of events you're generating. Because when we're looking for that immediate consistency, we need to stop the world, load all of the events into state, and then say, can we do the next thing based on that aggregated data? But what happens if you have 100,000 events? Like there's a penalty. There's a penalty to an ever increasingly large event stream. And so one solution that people use, which is like I think insidious. It seems like a good idea, but I'm going to suggest it's not. And it's taking the aggregate you have, loading a bunch of events in, and then just storing off the state at that time, the internal state, as a specific version. So then when you say, I want the bank account for this day, you say, what's the previous snapshot? And then you load the events that happened after that, aggregate it all together, and now you're caught up. That does factually work. It is a fine solution. It does work. But here's the problem. As your aggregates change, those snapshots need to change as well. You have to rebuild those snapshots. Here's another problem. Over time, as your events and as your model changes, the schema of your events change, the makeup of your events change, your business changes. So some events aren't relevant and some are new, and like these things change. So now you have to be dealing with all of these events in order and mapping them to an ever-changing moving target that is the snapshot. Now, here's my pitch. My pitch is, in order to make your life easier, choose architectural patterns that do not have such strong negatives as having to aggregate 100,000 events for any immediately consistent check. So if you're making a bank account, have a ledger system, interact with that ledger system, have that be the immediate consistency point, still store all of the events, listen to those events, do whatever you want to. Maybe instead have an event source aggregate or an immediate consistency boundary about a financial transaction. That has a life cycle. It's a finite life cycle. There's a certain number of events in it. You still want to be able to track the history through it. It's still very valuable. And then consider the ledger a separate concern, right? I think snapshots are what you do when a consultant comes in and you've designed your event source system, and the event streams are way too long. And the consultant comes in and says, I know how to fix your problem. They fix your problem, then they leave. And now you're left with a bunch of new problems, which is maintaining the snapshot over long periods of time.
Yeah, in Verbs, we basically treat snapshots as disposable, right? So at any point in Verbs, you can just truncate your snapshots table and everything continues to work just slower, right? So it is valuable, like Shawn, you mentioned, like for long running event streams, like you at a certain point, like 100,000 events is 100,000 events, right? And so if you're going to make a decision that's going to lead to long running event streams, like you're going to have to do something. You're going to have to cache something somewhere, right? And so we use snapshots for exactly that, but we intentionally do, like they get rewritten every request, right? Like they're getting destroyed and rewritten. It's just a cache between requests, you know, from our perspective. And so if the schema of something changes, well, great, it's going to get wiped out and reconstructed. So it doesn't matter. I do think you basically have to support people writing long event streams, right? Like at least I do. You know, I don't know if you do, but I do, because right, like the people we're offering Verbs to, like we're not going to sit them down and give them a long education in how to design an event stream before they go do it, right? So they're just going to go do it, and then they're going to ask us, hey, I have 100,000 events and my app is slow as shit, like what do I do? Right? So like I think it's just a hard requirement from our perspective, is that like people are going to use this to manage the state of things for a long time, that write a lot of events, and like how are we going to deal with that problem, you know?
I'm just gonna hop in here because I have to run in a minute, and I just want to underscore one sort of thought that feels really important to me, which is we can get caught up in talking about the terminology. I'm just peeking at the chat, and I see folks sort of going back and forth about, you know, is this essential for event sourcing, or is this, you know, this is the definition of this term. And all that is, you know, I think it's important to have shared definitions and understandings of the architecture that you choose. But I think the thing that I always come back to is event sourcing is just an understanding, for me, is just an understanding that the state of the world is the consequence of events, right? And trying to lean into that understanding more. And I think there are lots of different ways to approach that. And I think you can get really, really, you can focus on a lot of the specifics of how you might do that, and a lot of the specifics are there for like very hard won reasons that very smart people had to learn lessons to develop. So I'm not saying there's not value there, but I think the biggest takeaway that I would like to put out in the world, and one of the like sort of foundational concepts behind verbs, is just the world is the consequence of the events that happened before it, right? And that's just that is just reality. We can't change that. And if we build software that models that more accurately, we have more accurately modeled the world. And the beautiful sort of consequence of that is it's actually a lot easier to do it that way in many situations. And it's just like, I think that's wonderful.
Well,
You're here.
Yeah, so Chris will be rolling off. I just do want to take a moment to say thanks, Chris, for hanging out with us. This has been a fantastic and very enlightening conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Enjoy your concert.
Thank you so much. All right.
Peace, buddy.
Enjoy. Bye.
So I would like to ask probably a more simpler question. Let me help Chris get out of here.
I don't even know how to leave. Sorry, guys.
He looks terrified. He's like, wait,
I'm looking for a close button over here.
You can just close your tab. It'll be fine.
In the corner.
Get out of here, man. A more practical question, as somebody who is still very new to event sourcing and trying to get my head around the benefits and drawbacks to some of the things. Can either one of you give me any insight of whether it makes sense and if there are benefits to using these? I've seen like event sourcing databases, and I've just been using my regular MySQL to store my events. Is there a benefit to using an event sourcing database? And if so, what are they?
I don't know, so Shawn's gonna have to answer this one.
I have a little bit of experience with this, but I'm not by any means an expert. I would say that you can do anything you want with Postgres, and that's a very safe recommendation for any case. But there's a lot of ways to develop a system, and you don't always have like a monolithic application or something like this. You can use something like Get Event Store, which has built-in projections. You have a database with projections built in. And so maybe you just take that, you stick it somewhere, and you don't even control the rest of an application that feeds events into it. Who knows how you design your system, right? So there's a lot of ways to build those things. But I would say, unless you have an idea for a use case that can really leverage some of those unique features, just use Postgres, or feel free to experiment. Like I have a friend who's always talking about MartinDB, which I think is built on top of Postgres, but is kind of specializes for events. That's my recommendation. And if you become experienced enough that you want something different, then you won't listen to me anyway. So
yeah, if you know you need an event sourcing database, then you need an event sourcing database.
Yeah, that's about exactly what I was about to say. When you realize you need an event sourcing database, you'll know why. That's great. I guess another very practical question, and I'm trying to think of a simpler question, and I do apologize because we do have a ton of questions in chat. So I'm going to kind of start scrolling through. TJ, feel free to scroll through some of these and see if there's any you'd like to bubble up. But I'm guilty of this. I know it's a bad practice, but I think as developers, we've all done it, is when you're having an issue, let's say with your application, and something about the data is just not right. Maybe you kind of slip in there on the command line or using an app like tables or something and just change that one Boolean from false to true, or that's not really an option in event sourcing. I mean, I guess technically it is an option. You can always go in and always manipulate data because we are gods in our world, but just from a higher level of understanding, that's not it's a bad practice in general, but it's like a real no in the event sourcing world, unless I'm wrong.
Well,
Uh-oh.
you
Here we go.
can do whatever you want, right?
Right.
You can go in there and change stuff in your database. Now you do have to accept that, like, were you to destroy all of your database tables and reproject all of that data from events, unless you somehow created an event while doing that, that change will not be reflected, right? And so
Right.
that change is something that only happened when you did it, and it never got recorded that you did it, and so it won't be projected if you ever project that data again, right?
Right.
Now, I have that same problem, right? That, like, sometimes you got to go into an app and actually just do something in SSH, right? So we've been building a little package, it's not public yet, called Verbs Commands. That's
Ooh.
just a little CLI interface for firing events that is really nice and convenient. And so several times I've SSH'd into a server and just, like, used a nice little auto completing CLI to fire off some events, and and I feel a lot better and safer doing it that way, right? Because I know, like, when I designed this system, I thought about a lot of things. And so firing an event takes into account all of those protections that I thought about when designing, whereas going in and just messing with data in the database doesn't. But yeah, there's also the question of, like, editing your event data, right? Which is a really wild thing. And I think, like, using event sourcing as event sourcing, right? I think, like, the wisdom is, like, you shouldn't do that. But
Right.
I have, like, completely abused event sourcing before as well. And it's pretty crazy what you can do that there also, right? Like, I've, generated events for things that never happened and done all sorts of crazy things. And, like, you can make insane things happen if you want to play God with time.
Sure. What's the cost of modifying your event store, right? Yeah, if it's in Postgres, you could just go and modify the database table. But of course, that comes with a cost. So, I mean, if you're dispatching public events, right, in a multi-service setup, and you go and change the schema of one of them, and nobody's consuming that event, nothing is going to be a problem. So if you're aware of what your situation is very carefully, and if you're in a small scope or you're just introducing this stuff, then you can get away with murder. But once this stuff runs for a while, then you got to think, okay, if I modify an event in the thing, now all of my projections are fundamentally wrong. Well, how do I fix that? You can reproject everything. Or, I mean, realistically, all of this is event sourcing is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about event sourcing, CQRS, like a handful of things all together, right? Because event sourcing is just using events to generate state now. And all of the other things we use because we need these capabilities in our real production systems. But that means since we're using these messages and we're doing things like, I don't know, dispatching messages to a message broker like PubSub or Kafka or something, now you have a lot of complexity. So this is one of the things I would warn people about. Like, if you want to have, like, a really serious system, now you have to understand message architecture. You have to understand what idempotency means. You have to understand how to make your consumers not only handle duplicated messages because of at least once delivery semantics, but you also have to understand that messages can come in out of order because you're processing them with multiple consumers off of a queue, and they process at different rates, right? So there is a lot of fundamental complexity here. Overall, I find the complexity far less than the alternative way of modeling. But it is not a straightforward and completely simple thing, especially if you're coming from, like, a rapid application development situation like Laravel or Ruby on Rails. There's going to be some, like, bumps while you learn, okay, I'm dealing with these messaging architectures, which are usually, you only think of, microservice people. But honestly, if you want concurrency, if you want multiple consumers reading off of a queue, you have those concurrency challenges to overcome. So you need to be aware of those. Like, we all know what database transactions are for, but I have walked into system after system made by people who knew what transactions are for that use no transactions, right? So you can make things work, but will they be reliable? Will they cause a lot of operational issues? Like, to me, unplanned work is the enemy that I want to avoid. And so like when you're designing something like a projection and it's pulling off a message bus, you design it to be idempotent. So it's if the same event comes in multiple times, it's going to result in the same projection, right? Because multiple events is just going to happen. So there's tricks you can do if you know how you're building projections. For example, I'm not suggesting you do this. Don't do this. You can modify your event in the event stream and then just feed it into your projection. You're right. So you can do that. But the more advisable approach would be to either reproject that stream as a new correct stream, or you can also have a corrective event, an event that just says, hey, actually, no, this is the thing. And why a different event? Because these events are often then elevated to events that trigger behavior. We don't want to throw a dispatch an event that's going to trigger this behavior again. We just want to record that this data has changed and not trigger new behavior. So a new event will do that. You make a new event, you have it so that projections and aggregates, etc., understand that this is a data change, and that your event consumers that go send somebody an email are not going to trigger because it's a completely different event.
Wow, that's a lot to consume. I'm going to have to go back and watch my own podcast to make sure like I get my head around all this.
Well, and this is the thing, like, I feel like I have, like, the rest of my career will be thinking about these things, right? Like, I'm I've been touching events in production for 4 years now, something like that, right? And like, there's just decades of considerations ahead of me. And I think, I learned it from Shawn's video originally. So Shawn's clearly been thinking about it longer than I have, right? And there are just so many considerations, right? And like the different scales and environments that you work in, the different priorities that those different applications have, whether it's this one cares about distribution way more than speed, this one cares about speed way more than distribution. Well, like those are different considerations, and you're going to architect things differently. But I think to sort of keep it at the level of like events are events, right? And sort of like Shawn was saying, avoid sort of all of the many disciplines surrounding event sourcing. Like, I think your flexibility of like what approaches you want to take in architecture is just so much greater when you have this reliable stream of events to deal with, right? And like, if you can, and the point Shawn made earlier, like really early in the podcast, which is that like it's all atomic, right? And just like an event is an event, and that's all that matters. Like, you can build these like incredibly flexible, good architectures. And, I think the reason, I'm so frustrated often by the naming of things, but I think the reason a lot of these things have names, to be kind, is that they are really reusable, because you can take this approach from project to project to project, because an event is an event. And whether it's an event in one project or event in another, like the domain of events is its own sort of mini domain, and you can solve problems for that domain specifically, and then they're portable solutions that can be carried around from project to project, which I think is why, ideas like CQRS or whatever, like, are these incredibly sticky ideas that every event person will eventually run into and, be bugbeared by for eternity.
Yeah, ultimately, it's all about messages, right? Events are one type of message. You have commands, events, queries, responses, right? These like messages, like the fact that we have an event is not enough. There's also an envelope on the event, right? The event describes the thing that happened. Maybe an authorization was completed, and then we have the authorization token type stuff, that some details related to that event and a timestamp in that payload. But the message, there's a message envelope that encapsulates that payload that is also part of the important thing. And that envelope says stuff like, this is related to maybe this event stream, or this message was caused by this previous message, right? So If you receive a message and it has an identifier, which the individual ID that you would have for that event would be a message ID in the envelope.
Mhm.
You can say any events I'm dispatching now is a direct consequence of that. You can mark that as this is related to that previous message. So then you can map commands to events to this, to that, and you can create traces across a distributed system like this. But like you can't do that if you just have the event. It's really about messaging and messaging patterns, and an event is just one type.
Ooh, love it.
I know. I feel like we've covered so much here, and yet I think Shawn said it, or Daniel said it earlier. Just scratching the surface of what there is to uncover. Is there anything we might have brushed over, or any points that we didn't really discuss you think are prevalent to somebody coming into event sourcing, or somebody in event sourcing and having a better understanding of some of the concepts? No?
I mean, I would just like ask people to abandon fear here, right? And
Yeah.
just the fact that there is a career's worth of depth here shouldn't stop you from getting in there and building something right now, right? Like get in there, build some stuff, put some events somewhere, store some events, and like if you mess it up, you'll figure it out, like that there's only figuring it out to do between here and death, right?
I
like
love that.
start storing some events, and it's so much more fun, I promise.
Yeah, my advice is don't have a web framework or a web use case in mind, or any kind of, just start with a file. Like if you're using PHP, just have a PHP file, make a couple events, put these things together, and then just run the PHP file and see it work. Just like these ideas are actually very, very simple. Messaging will never be simple, right? That's just true. But these ideas of, you have events, and events can be projected into memory, and then you can call methods on that to make decisions to create new events. You can do that right now in 12 lines of code. And I think getting this like kind of experience is enough to start making you feel more confident.
All right. I feel like this is going to be a good point to wrap up. This was not meant to be like a tutorial on how to do event sourcing.
No way.
So we really hope we've given you enough information to get you interested in event sourcing, so you can discover the benefits yourself. I think that's great. I really can't thank you guys enough for coming here. Any last words before we wrap up? I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to get out anything they have.
No, I'm just thank you for inviting me. It's been really nice to be here and have this
Sean,
conversation.
you kidding me? I also, and this is all seriousness here, I also want to make sure that you guys understand, and you can, Daniel, let Chris know as well. The moment call for papers are open for PHP Tech next year, I will be pinging you all on Telegram. So you might want to block me now, because I'm going to be like on there. I need to see these talks. I need to see talks on event sourcing at PHP Tech. I just think it's just such a beneficial solution that so many people are not taking advantage of. So PHP Tech 2025, the website will be up probably this weekend. You mark those dates, you don't plan anything, and you wait for the release for a call for papers, because we need some event sourcing talks.
I mean, I'll be there, so.
That's right,
And
you
we
will.
love TJ.
Better be there. Short of that, event sorcery, Shawn McCool, coolest name on the internet still. Make sure you check out his event sorcery on YouTube. It's free now. Chris's podcast, Over Engineered Podcast. That sounds redundant, but it wasn't. and Daniel's No Plans to Merge podcast and Taking Care of Business podcast, as well as Chris's and Daniel's, if you're a Laravel developer, Verbs package. Go check that out and get started with event sourcing. And if you have any issues and you want to hate somebody, hate those guys, not me. Everybody hates me already.
I'll take some hate.
All right. That's it for this episode of PHP Roundtable. That was almost a slip. And look forward to you again. Remember, we live stream the second Friday of every month, typically at 3 p.m. Pacific time. But again, that can fluctuate depending on the panel and where they are in this world. So come check us out next month. And if you want to be a guest on PHP Roundtable, reach out to myself, reach out to TJ. Let us know what topics you'd like to talk about, and we'll get you on the panel. All right, thanks again, guys, for hanging out. I really, really do appreciate this. I've been looking forward to it. We've been talking about it for a little over a month now. I just couldn't wait for the next roundtable to come around so that we could get this going. So thanks again, everybody, and everybody watching live. Appreciate you. Bye.
See ya.
Peace, y'all.